the morning Lena Voss walked into Cutter's Bluff, Montana. She had 40 cents in her coat pocket and a name she didn't plan on using much longer. Her husband had been dead 11 months. The farm in Nebraska had gone to the bank 8 months after that. Her sister in Billings had written back once, a short letter, apologetic in the way only people who don't intend to help are apologetic, and Lena had not written again. She was 26 years old, and she was done asking. She'd ridden the last 40 miles on a freight wagon, with a man hauling pine lumber who hadn't spoken more than 4 words, the entire trip, which were suited her fine. She had nothing to say either. She climbed down at the edge of town, thanked him, and stood in the dust, watching the wagon roll on without her. Cutter's Bluff was not a prosperous town. It had a feed store, a livery, a church with a crooked steeple, 2 saloons, and a hotel that looked like it had been built in a hurry and never forgiven for it. The mountains to the west were white-capped and indifferent. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind came down off the peaks, with a cold edge to it, even though it was only late September. She went into the feed store because it was the only place with an open door. The man behind the counter looked up. He had a broad, sun-darkened face and a gray mustache going to rust at the corners. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," Lena said. "I'm looking for work any kind. Cooking, cleaning, mending. I'm told there are ranches outside of town." He studied her for a moment, not unkindly, the way a man studies a horse he's trying to price fairly. "Barlow Ranch might be your best bet," he said. "He lost his cook in August. Woman went back east to tend her mother. He's been eating at the hotel since then, and by all accounts he's sick of it." "How far out?" 4 miles north. "Can't miss it. Big cottonwood at the gate." She thanked him and walked back out into the wind. 4 miles was nothing. She had walked farther than that, on days when she had no reason to walk anywhere at all, just to have something to do with her hands and feet while her mind worked through the grief. She set out north along the rutted track and didn't look back at the town. The cottonwood was enormous, its leaves gone to yellow, and half of them already down, scattered across the gate and the fence on either side, in a way that made the whole entrance look like it had been decorated for a funeral. She stopped there a moment, her hand on the post, and looked up the long lane toward the house. It was a working ranch, and it looked like one. The house was plain and functional, 2 stories, unpainted wood gone silver with weathering. The barn beyond it was in better repair than the house, which told her something. There were cattle visible through the fence slats, and a man in the near pasture checking the line on a water trough. He had his back to her. She walked up the lane. He heard her when she was about 20 feet out and turned. She got her first look at Cord Barlow then, a tall man, lean in the way of men, who work hard and eat whatever's convenient, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same granite as the mountains behind him. He was somewhere past 40, she guessed, though the sun had done its work on his face, and it was difficult to be certain. His eyes were a gray-green that reminded her of creek water in autumn, and they fixed on her with the kind of attention that was not rude and not warm, just absolutely present. "Mr. Barlow?" she said. "That's right. My name is Lena Voss. I was told in town that you might be in need of a cook." He looked at her for a moment. Not at her face particularly, not at her clothes, just at her, the whole of her standing there with 40 cents and no hat. "Who told you that?" he said. "The man at the feed store. I don't know his name, Hargrove." He pulled off his gloves and tucked them into his belt. "You have experience. I cooked for my husband and his hired hands for 3 years on a wheat farm in Nebraska. I can cook for any number of people. I can bake bread, preserve, put up stores for winter. I can do whatever else needs doing inside the house as well." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the cottonwood at the gate, and a drift of yellow leaves came down the lane between them. "I've got 4 men on payroll," he said. "And myself. That's 5 mouths at every meal. 3 times a day. Yes, sir. I can offer a room off the kitchen, meals, and $8 a month." It was a fair wage. Not generous, but fair, and she was not in a position to negotiate. "That's acceptable," she said. He nodded once, already turning back to the water trough. "Kitchen's unlocked. I expect supper at 6. And that was all. He did not offer to carry anything for her, did not walk her to the house, did not make a single remark about her appearing out of the road with no horse and no bag. He simply turned back to his work, as though the matter was settled, and there was no further use discussing it. She stood there for a half a second. Then she walked to the house. The kitchen was cold, and the larder was low, but not bare. She found dried beans, a sack of cornmeal, a side of salt pork, potatoes that were starting to go, onions that were not, coffee that smelled like it had been sitting since spring. There was a cast iron stove that had not been properly cleaned in some time. She rolled up her sleeves. She had the beans soaking by noon and the stove cleaned and burning hot by 2. She cut the best of the potatoes into a pan with the onions and the salt pork and set it low. She made cornbread in the cast iron skillet, and she made it right, with enough fat in the pan that the bottom crust came out the color of old mahogany. She found a jar of put-up tomatoes on a shelf behind a broken lantern, and she opened it and heated it with the rest of the pork drippings into something close to a sauce. At 6 o'clock she set the table for 5. At 6:03 the door opened and they came in. 4 ranch hands, young to middle-aged, smelling of cattle and dirt and a long day's work. They stopped in the kitchen doorway. The one closest to her, a red-faced boy of maybe 20, looked at the table, and then at her, and then at the food. "Well," he said, to no one in particular there. They sat, they ate. There was not much conversation. Men who work outdoors all day do not have a great deal of talking left in them by evening, and these 4 seemed to have come to some unspoken agreement that silence was a reasonable price for a hot meal. She heard them cleaning their plates. She heard one of them, she didn't know his name yet, go back for more cornbread without asking. That was enough. Cord Barlow came in at 6:15. He sat at the head of the table and ate without comment. And when he was done, he carried his own plate to the sink, which she had not expected. "Supper was good," he said, and went out. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed, in the quiet, in the warmth from the stove. Then she washed the dishes and went to her room. It was small. It had a cot, a washstand, a window that looked out at the barn. The mattress was thin and the room smelled of wood and old dust. She sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the wall and thought, for the first time in nearly a year, that she might be all right. The weeks turned over. October came in gray and bright, in alternating days, and she learned the ranch and its rhythms, and the men who worked it. There was Hector, who was 22 and from Texas, and unfailingly cheerful in the way that only people who have not yet been beaten down by life can be. There was Dale, who was quiet and competent, and brought her a basket of eggs one morning, without explanation, which she later learned meant he had decided she was trustworthy. There was Seb, who complained about everything, with the particular tone of a man who complains not because he is unhappy, but because it is the only way he knows to participate in a conversation. And there was old Prentice, who had worked for Cord Barlow for 11 years, and who regarded Lena for exactly 3 days before appearing one evening in the kitchen doorway and saying, "You need more wood for the stove," and going and fetching it without waiting for an answer. She did not see much of Cord Barlow. He was out before breakfast most mornings, and sometimes she left his plate warming in the oven and did not see him until supper. He said little. He was not unfriendly. He was simply a man whose interior life was conducted at a volume she could not yet hear. Twice she caught him watching her. Once through the window when she was hanging laundry on the line. Once in the evening when she was mending a tear in one of Hector's work shirts. Both times he looked away without embarrassment, as if he had merely been looking at whatever was in front of him, and she happened to be there. In November the first snow came, and with it a change in the work of the ranch that she hadn't anticipated. There was more to do inside, more to preserve, more to stock, more to account for. She started going through the larder, with real attention, making notes on what was low and what would need ordering before the roads got bad. She found that the household accounts were kept in a ledger on the kitchen shelf, a battered thing with Cord Barlow's handwriting in it, large and careful. The writing of a man who had learned to write as an adult and took it seriously. She did not touch the ledger, but she noticed it. One evening in mid-November, Cord came into the kitchen earlier than usual and found her at the table with a sheet of paper, writing out a list of stores they'd need to get through the winter. He stood in the doorway long enough that she looked up. "Just working out the stores," she said. "We're going to run short on flour and coffee and lamp oil before February if we don't order soon. The cornmeal, too. I didn't want to wait." He crossed the kitchen and stood at the edge of the table, looking at her list. He was quiet for long enough that she began to wonder if she'd overstepped. "I was going to drive into town Friday," he said. "That's soon enough, if we get everything on this list." He looked at the list again. He reached out and moved the paper slightly, as if a half-inch made it easier to read. She noticed his hands, wide, scarred, the knuckles gone rough with cold and work. "Add lamp wicking," he said. "I forgot it last time." "Yes, sir." He straightened up and went to the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood there drinking it, which was the longest she had ever seen him stay in the kitchen when there was no meal on the table. "My wife used to do this," he said after a while. Not to her, exactly. More like a thought he hadn't meant to say aloud. She didn't answer. She wrote lamp wicking at the bottom of the list. He put the cup in the sink and went out. She sat with that for a long time after he was gone. She had not known he'd been married. No one had mentioned it. She did not ask around about it either. Some things were not hers to know yet, and maybe never would be. December arrived, and the world outside the windows became simple and white and very quiet. On the coldest nights, she could hear the wind against the eaves and the house settling, and she lay on her cot and listened and thought it was not a bad sound. It was the sound of shelter. She had forgotten, in the year that had passed, what it was like to be inside something that kept the cold out. She had taken to baking on Saturdays. Not out of obligation. She baked because it was the warmest thing you could do for a house, the smell of bread and sugar going into every room and corner and staying there. She made apple cake when she could get apples, and she made molasses cookies that were slightly too sweet, which Hector declared the best cookies he had ever eaten, and Seb declared excessive, which she knew by now was how he expressed enjoyment. One Saturday she came into the kitchen to find a jar of preserved cherries on the counter that had not been there the night before. There was no note, no explanation. She looked at the jar for a moment. She used the cherries in a buckle that afternoon. She left a piece wrapped in cloth on the shelf where the jar had appeared. In the morning the cloth was empty. That was December. January was the hardest month on the ranch, the way January always is. Long and gray and grinding, the kind of cold that makes every task twice as difficult and half as rewarding. The cattle needed more attention. The men came in colder and more tired and hungrier, and she matched them step for step, keeping the kitchen warm and the food hot and the coffee never fully empty. It was mid-January when she heard about the bank. She had not been paying attention to the ranch's finances, because it was not her business to. But Prentice mentioned it to Dale at breakfast one morning, not realizing or not caring that she was still at the stove and could hear everything. A man named Mr. Dowell, the loan officer at the bank in town, had been pressing Cord Barlow to settle a note that came due in the spring. The note had originally been extended twice, once when Cord's wife was ill, and once when the cattle price fell 2 years running. Mr. Dowell, Prentice said, was not inclined to extend it a third time. He had said so plainly when Cord went into town in December. He had suggested, with the particular politeness of a man who means to be threatening, that it might be time for Mr. Barlow to consider what the ranch was worth if he needed to liquidate it quickly. Lena kept her back to the room and her hands on the stove and listened. That evening she got out the household ledger. She knew she had no right to it, but she looked at it for a long time, and then she opened it, and she sat at the kitchen table and she read it. She read it the way she had read everything in her life, carefully, looking for what was real underneath what was written. What was real was this: the ranch was not failing. It was not prospering the way it could, but it was not failing. The cattle numbers were solid. The winter feed stores were adequate. The debt was large but not unsurvivable. If the spring sale came in at a reasonable price, what was eating the margin was everything peripheral: the hotel meals before she arrived, the disorganized ordering, the small wastes that accumulate in a house with no one managing it properly. She did the arithmetic twice. She sat with it. Then she put the ledger away, exactly as she had found it, and went to bed. In the morning she asked Prentice, as casually as she could, when Cord planned to take the cattle to market in the spring. April, usually, Prentice said, drives them to Miles City. What's the price been running? He looked at her for a moment, not unfriendly. Fair enough, last couple years. Better this year, they say. She nodded and went back to the stove. That afternoon she sat down and wrote out 2 pages of figures on a fresh sheet of paper. She organized them the way her father had taught her. Her father, who had kept books for a grain merchant in Iowa, and who had believed that, if a woman was going to survive in this world, she had better understand money, because no one was going to manage it for her. She worked out what the spring sale would need to bring in, what could be cut before then, and what the net position would look like against the banknote if everything held. The numbers were uncomfortable, but not fatal. That was the thing. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket and went about her work. It was 3 days before she decided to say anything. She did not want to presume. She was still technically the cook. She had not been asked her opinion on the ranch's finances, and offering it unsolicited to a man like Cord Barlow felt like the kind of thing that could go very wrong. But she thought about Mr. Dowell and his particular politeness, and she thought about Cord's face when he came in from long days. The way exhaustion sat on him differently than it sat on the younger men, as if his was deeper, more layered, not just physical. On the 3rd evening, when the men had cleared out and Cord was the last one at the table with his coffee, she sat down across from him. He looked up. "I looked at the ledger," she said. "I know I shouldn't have. But I did, and I want to be honest with you about it." He was very still. "I did the numbers," she said. "Your spring sale, at current price estimates, should cover the banknote and leave you enough to operate through the summer, if you cut the ordering costs and keep the herd numbers where they are. The problem isn't the note. The problem is the margin around it. The small things." He said nothing. His expression had not changed, but she thought she saw something move behind his eyes. "The hotel meals alone, before I came," she said. "That was $60 you didn't need to spend. The ordering, driving into town twice a month because the list was never right. That's where on the horses and your time. There are 6 or 7 places where money is going that it doesn't need to go, and none of them are big, but together they're big enough that they're making the note look worse than it is. She set the folded paper on the table. I wrote it out, she said. You don't have to look at it. I just thought you should know that the numbers aren't as bad as Mr. Dowell wants you to think they are. He looked at the paper. He looked at her. How do you know about Dowell? He said. I heard Prentice. A long moment. Outside, the wind was working on the eaves again. My wife managed the books, he said. Yes, sir, I gathered that. He picked up the paper and opened it and read it, and she watched him read it. It took him a while. He was not a fast reader, but he was a careful one. When he was done, he set it down on the table and smoothed it with his hand. You're right about the ordering, he said. I knew that. I just hadn't. He stopped. I hadn't gotten around to fixing it. It's a lot to manage alone. He looked at her for a moment. Not the studied, measuring look of the first day. Something more direct. Something she didn't quite have a word for. You do good work, Miss Voss, he said. Thank you, Mr. Barlow. He folded the paper and put it in his breast pocket and took his cup to the sink and went out. But at the door he paused for a second, with his hand on the frame, not turning around. The cherries were from my root cellar, he said. I should have said. Then he was gone. February turned to March, and March brought mud, and the particular exhausting hope of early spring. The feeling that things might start moving again after the long stillness, that the worst was behind you, but the work of getting to the other side was still entirely ahead. The cattle were restless. The men were restless. Even the mornings had a different quality to them, the light coming earlier and sharper, catching the ice on the water troughs and throwing it back. She had taken over the household accounts entirely by then, without either of them making much of a formal arrangement about it. It had happened gradually, the way most things that matter happen. One conversation, one decision, one list checked and corrected, and then one day she was simply doing it, and neither of them thought to remark on it. The men had accepted her fully, sometime in January, she thought, though she couldn't have named the exact moment. With Hector, it had been easy from the start. With Dale, it was the eggs. With Seb, it was the cookies, whatever he said. With Prentice, it was the morning. She came outside in the cold without being asked and helped him break the ice on the water troughs, because she could see he wasn't going to make it through all of them before breakfast, and she had an extra 30 minutes. He hadn't said anything, but the next day he had fixed the latch on the kitchen door that had been sticking all winter without her mentioning it. She had a life there, she realized. Modest and practical and made of ordinary things, flour and firewood and cattle prices and the sound of men coming in out of the cold to a warm room. But it was a life. She had not expected that. Cord Barlow remained what he had always been, which was present and careful, and just slightly beyond where she could easily reach. But the distance between them had changed. She noticed it in small ways. He had stopped waiting until 6:15 to come in to supper. He started coming at 6, and sometimes at 5:50, and on a night in early March, he came in at 5:30 and sat at the table with the ledger while she cooked, going over the numbers quietly, and she moved around him without thinking about it, and it felt entirely natural, and neither of them commented on it. He drove to Miles City in early April with the cattle, Prentice and Dale and Hector riding with him. Seb stayed at the ranch. Lena stayed at the ranch. They were gone 5 days. On the second day, Seb, who was not a conversational man, came into the kitchen in the evening and sat down without being invited and said, "You think it'll go all right? The sale?" She looked at him. It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her. "I think so," she said. "The numbers are good." Prices are up. He nodded. Good, he said, and went out. When Cord came back on the 5th day, he came into the kitchen directly from outside, still dusty from the road, and he set the bank receipt on the table in front of her. She looked at it. The note was settled. The balance was better than she had calculated. The prices had come in higher than expected. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that direct look, the one she had been trying to name for 3 months. She had a name for it now. It worked, he said. Yes, she said. It did. He sat down then, which he had never done while she was still cooking, and he put his hat on the table and ran a hand over his face, and for the first time she saw the exhaustion go out of him rather than just settle deeper in. He looked younger, or maybe just lighter, and she had a sudden involuntary memory of what he must have looked like before everything. Before the wife, before the note, before all the years of just holding on. I couldn't have done this without you, he said. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without decoration, as if he was reporting a fact. She turned back to the stove because she needed to do something with her hands. You were doing it, she said. I just helped organize it. Lena. She had not heard him use her given name before. She stilled. I was not doing it, he said. Not really. She did not turn around. But she said, you would have figured it out, maybe. A pause. But it would have taken longer, and I'd have done it alone. She heard him push the chair back. She heard him cross the kitchen. He stopped close enough behind her that she could have turned around and been face to face with him if she'd turned around. She didn't. I'm not good at this, he said. His voice was different now, slower, more deliberate, as if he was choosing each word from a very small, very careful supply. I didn't think I'd need to be again, after Margaret. Margaret. That was her name then. She filed it away, not as information but as something that deserved respect. I'm not asking for anything, she said. I know you're not. He was quiet for a moment. That's part of why I'm asking. She turned around. He was very close. He was looking at her with that look she had finally named, the look of a man who has made a decision and is not sure if it's a decision the other person has made yet. I'm asking if you'd consider staying, not as the cook, as more than that. I know I'm a plain man. I know I don't say things the way they ought to be said, but I'd try. I'd try to do better at it. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Nebraska. She thought about the farm and the bank, and the letter from her sister and 40 cents in a coat pocket, and a freight wagon, and a cold road, and a gate with a big cottonwood tree dropping yellow leaves across it, like a funeral decoration. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Something happened to his face. Something small, something restrained, but she saw it. All right, he said. All right, she said. He stayed for supper. He sat at the table while she finished cooking, and he told her, haltingly, in the way of a man who has not talked much in years and is relearning the habit, about the drive to Miles City, the cattle, the weather, the prices, a brief story about Hector that made her laugh. She listened and she cooked, and the kitchen was warm, and the light was going orange through the west window, and outside, the first real warmth of spring was starting to come up out of the ground. They were married in May, on a Saturday at the small church in Cutter's Bluff with the crooked steeple. Reverend Aldous performed the ceremony. Prentice stood up with Cord. Hector cried, which he denied, and which no one mentioned again. The summer that followed was not easy. There is no easy summer on a ranch. Not really. But it was good in the way that things are good when you are working toward something real, something that belongs to you. She learned to ride, finally, and Cord taught her with a patience that surprised her, as if teaching was something that came naturally to him, that talking did not. She learned to read cattle the way he read them, to see what they needed before they told you. She learned the land. The creek that ran good in wet years and needed watching in dry ones. The south pasture that went soft in the spring and had to be rested. The ridge where you could stand in the evening and see all the way to the mountains and understand for a moment. Something you couldn't quite put into words. 2 years on, the ranch was doing better than it had in a decade. The fences were right. The herd was healthy. The household accounts were kept in a new ledger, and both their handwriting was in it. Sometimes in the evening, after supper, they sat on the porch together in the late light, not always talking. She had come to understand that this was how he was most himself. Present and quiet, and there, completely there, in a way that some people cannot manage even when they're speaking directly to you. She did not mind the quiet. She never had. One evening, Cord looked out at the land and said, without preamble, "I used to think I was just holding on." She waited. "Now I think we're building something," he said. She looked out at the pasture, at the mountains in the distance going pink in the last light. "We are," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the way he did some evenings, without announcing it, without making it a thing, just taking it and holding it. And that was how you knew, with Cord Barlow, what he meant. She held on,